She returned to the ranch her late husband left behind, this time with a new husband and her daughter. They came just to sell it, to finally close that chapter of life. But what they found inside those old walls changed everything they thought they knew about love, memory, and home. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The road to the old ranch stretched before them like a ribbon of dust, worn thin by time and the passing of years. The pickup rattled over the cracked earth, its tires stirring pale clouds that drifted behind them and disappeared into the horizon. The late afternoon sun burned low, painting the fields in long shadows and glints of gold that clung to the dry grass. Emily Harlow sat in the passenger seat, her hands clasped tightly around a folded letter that had been opened and refolded so many times its edges had softened like fabric. The handwriting on the yellowed paper was still strong. Steady, careful, and unmistakably his. Her husband Ryan drove in silence. His knuckles were pale against the steering wheel, not from anger, but from an effort to stay composed. He had never seen this land before, and though he tried to meet the journey with quiet acceptance, there was a distance in his gaze, a polite detachment that barely concealed his discomfort. To him, this place existed only in stories and photographs, in fragments of a life that had ended long before he entered Emily's world. In the back seat, 10-year-old Lily pressed her forehead to the window, tracing shapes in the dust that clung to the glass. The girl barely remembered the ranch. She was 5 when her father died, too young to carry the weight of those days, but not too young to sense how they had marked her mother. Every now and then, she glanced toward Emily, curious, unsure whether this trip was supposed to make them happy or sad. The letter in Emily's hands trembled slightly with the motion of the truck. She didn't need to read it. She knew every word, by heart. Tom Harlow had written it on a quiet evening not long before the accident, as though he had known his time was limited. It wasn't a farewell, not really. More like a final piece of advice from a man who had built his life out of honesty and earth. If you ever find love again, it said, sell the ranch. Don't cling to this place or to me. Let the wind carry what's left of us. Start new. Find peace. For 5 years, she had done exactly that, or at least she thought she had. She'd sold the farm equipment, packed what little could be salvaged, and moved to the city. She found work, stability, and eventually Ryan, who brought her a kind of safety she had once thought impossible. He was patient where Tom had been restless, deliberate where Tom had been daring. Ryan didn't belong to the land, and that had been a comfort once. But as they drove through the fading light, Emily felt a quiet unease creeping through her chest. She had told herself this was only a visit, to clean up what remained, meet the realtor, and put the property up for sale. Yet every mile closer to the ranch made that promise feel less certain. When they crested the final hill, the ranch came into view. The house stood alone on the flat expanse of land, framed by fences that had long since leaned into disrepair. The roof sagged in the middle, the paint had peeled away, and the porch railing hung at a slant, like an arm too tired to wave. The barn beside it was half collapsed, and the fields that had once shimmered with wheat were buried under wild grass and thistle. For a moment, Emily couldn't breathe. It wasn't the ruin that hurt her, it was the familiarity. Time had stripped the place of color, but not of memory. Ryan slowed the truck and parked near the gate. The metal creaked when he pushed it open, a sound so raw and sharp that it cut through the heavy air. Emily stepped out and was struck by the smell, the dry, sweet scent of old hay mixed with dust, and something faintly floral, like the ghost of spring. Beneath the stillness, she thought she could hear echoes, the bark of a dog, the low hum of a tractor, her own laughter carried by the wind. Lily climbed out after her, squinting against the light. "It's big," she said softly. though no one answered. The girl's shoes crunched on the gravel as she followed her mother toward the porch. The steps groaned under their weight, and a board splintered slightly beneath Emily's heel. She brushed her fingers along the doorframe, feeling the rough wood beneath her palm. The house hadn't changed. It still had the same stubborn shape, the same silent dignity, as though it had been waiting. Ryan lingered by the truck, scanning the property. "We should make sure it's safe before staying inside," he said, more out of habit than fear. But Emily had already pushed the door open. The smell of dust and age met her instantly, thick and dry. Sunlight filtered through cracks in the shutters, laying uneven stripes across the floor. Everything was still there. The worn table near the window, the iron stove with a rusted pipe, the faded curtains she had sewn herself long ago. Even the old clock above the mantel hung frozen at 7:42, the minute the storm had struck all those years ago. Her eyes stung as she remembered the noise, the way the wind had screamed like a living thing, tearing the roof from the barn, the rain hammering the windows. They had found Tom after dawn, crushed beneath the tractor that had been his pride. She had never come back after that. Lily wandered through the kitchen, trailing her fingers along the counter. "It smells weird," she murmured, wrinkling her nose. But then she smiled faintly when she saw the row of chipped mugs still hanging from their hooks. One of them read "Tom's Coffee" in blue letters. Outside, a sound broke the stillness, a faint thud, then another, like hooves striking wood. Emily froze. Ryan, hearing it too, stepped toward the door, his expression wary. "Probably the wind," he said, but the noise came again, clearer this time, followed by a low, drawn-out neigh. Emily's heart leapt. "There shouldn't be anything alive out there," she whispered. Yet even as she said it, she was already moving toward the barn. The path was overgrown with weeds that clutched at her jeans as she walked. The barn doors hung half open, one barely attached to its hinge. When she stepped inside, the air was thick with the smell of hay and something else, something living. It took her eyes a moment to adjust to the dim light slanting through the gaps in the roof. Then she saw them. A horse stood near the far wall, ribs visible beneath its coat, but eyes bright and alert. A handful of chickens perched on the rafters, feathers dusty but full. In a corner, a pair of dogs lifted their heads, tails thumping weakly against the floorboards. They were thin, their fur matted, but they were alive. And they looked at her, not with fear, but with cautious recognition. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She took a slow step forward, feeling the floorboards creak beneath her weight. The horse stamped once, its ears flicking toward her. She spoke softly, though she didn't know what she meant to say. The words came anyway, something between apology and awe. Lily appeared beside her, her face lit with wonder. "Mom, they survived," she whispered, as though afraid to break the fragile moment. Ryan stood in the doorway, his brow furrowed. "How is that possible? No one's been here in years." But Emily didn't answer. She couldn't. The sight before her felt like a miracle and a rebuke all at once. Against every law of time and nature, life had clung to this place. She spent the rest of the evening walking through the barn, counting what remained, an old trough, cracked and half buried in dirt, bales of hay turned to dust, a rusted water pump that still groaned faintly when she pressed its handle. The animals watched her with cautious eyes, and she felt something she hadn't in years, a sense of being needed. When night fell, they made camp inside the house. Ryan unrolled sleeping bags while Emily lit a small lantern she'd brought from the truck. The faint glow threw long shadows across the walls, catching on the outlines of the furniture, the shelves, the photographs still hanging in their frames. In one of them, Tom stood by the porch, his hand resting on a fence post, his smile quiet and confident. Emily turned it face down before lying beside it. Sleep came slowly. The house shifted with every gust of wind, the wood groaning as though remembering the weight of storms long past. Somewhere outside, a dog barked once, then fell silent. Emily lay awake, listening to the rhythm of the night. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was visiting a grave. She felt like she was standing on the edge of something that refused to die. Near midnight, she rose and found the letter again. The paper rustled softly in her hands. The words were the same as always. Simple. Final. But tonight they felt different. When Tom had written, "Sell the ranch," maybe he hadn't meant to erase the past. Maybe he had only wanted her to find her way back to life, wherever it chose to grow. The next morning dawned clear and sharp. Dew glittered on the tall grass, and the air smelled clean after the long night. Emily stepped outside, barefoot, the cold earth pressing against her skin. The barn stood in the distance, bathed in the soft gold of sunrise. She could see the movement of the animals within, shadows shifting in the light. Ryan joined her on the porch, rubbing his arms against the chill. "We'll need to get someone out here soon," he said. "A realtor, maybe a surveyor. If we start today, we can't leave them," Emily said quietly. He turned to her, surprised. "The animals? They've survived this long. We can't just walk away." Ryan sighed, his breath clouding in the air. "Emily, you know this isn't practical." She looked out toward the barn again. "Maybe not. But it's right." Lily came out then, clutching the same mug that read, "Tom's Coffee." She smiled sleepily, unaware of the heaviness between her parents. "Can we feed them, Mom?" Emily nodded. "Yes. Let's start there." As the sun climbed higher, the three of them crossed the yard together. The house behind them stood in silence, its broken windows catching the morning light like watchful eyes. Somewhere in the rafters, a bird stirred and took flight. The day ahead would be full of work. Too much for three people, and too much for one heart still caught between past and present. But as Emily walked toward the barn, she felt something she hadn't in a long, long time. It wasn't grief. It wasn't even nostalgia. It was belonging. And though she told herself they would stay only for a few weeks, just until things were in order, just until the animals were safe, part of her already knew the truth. The land wasn't done with her yet. The house had waited too long to let her go. Morning came with a pale, steady light that crept through the broken shutters and settled softly over the worn furniture. The air inside the house was cold enough for their breath to show, but outside, the first hints of warmth stirred in the grass. Emily woke before the others. For a moment, she lay still, listening to the silence that had its own kind of heartbeat, the gentle creak of wood, the distant rustle of wind in the tall weeds, the faint cluck of hens somewhere near the barn. She rose quietly, careful not to wake Lily, who slept curled in her blanket, and stepped outside. The sky was a wide canvas of gray and blue, the kind that promised a clear day if one had the patience to wait. The yard looked different in the morning. The neglect was still there. The sagging fences, the collapsed troughs, the rusted tools half buried in dirt. But it all seemed less like decay and more like pause, as though time had been waiting for someone to press play again. The animals were stirring. The dogs came first, padding out of the barn with tentative steps. One of them, a tan mongrel with mismatched eyes, wagged its tail and watched her carefully. The horse lifted its head when she approached, snorted softly, then returned to chewing at a patch of dry grass. Emily found an old bucket and began clearing out what was left of the feed room. The smell of dust filled her lungs, and her hands grew black with grime. But there was something quietly satisfying about the simple rhythm of it. By the time Ryan appeared on the porch, rubbing sleep from his eyes. She had already filled 2 buckets with water from the well and scattered a small handful of grain she'd found in a sealed tin. It wasn't much, but it was enough to draw the chickens out from the shadows, their wings fluttering weakly as they pecked at the earth. "You're up early," Ryan said, his voice thick with sleep. "Couldn't rest," she replied. "The animals need care. They've gone too long without anyone." He studied her for a moment, then looked out toward the barn. "We should make a plan. The realtor will want photos, maybe an inspection report. If we can get the place cleaned up a bit, it'll sell faster." Emily wiped her hands on her jeans. "I know," she said softly. "But first things first. We can't just leave them like this." Ryan hesitated. "Em, you know I understand why this place matters to you. But the sooner we close this chapter, the better it'll be for all of us. It's not healthy to keep holding on." "I'm not holding on," she said, though even as she spoke, she wasn't sure it was true. "I'm just doing what needs to be done." He gave a small nod and turned back toward the house, muttering something about coffee. Emily stood there for a while after he'd gone, watching the light shift across the land. It was strange how familiar everything still felt. The angles of the barn, the worn grooves of the path to the well, the faint outline of the orchard long since gone wild. She could almost see Tom there, his broad shoulders bent over a plow, his laugh carried by the wind. The image came and went like a flicker, leaving behind only the ache of memory. Days began to blur into each other after that. Each morning, Emily and Lily worked side by side, cleaning, repairing, feeding. They patched holes in the barn roof using scraps of wood and old tarp they'd found in the shed. They cleared out the animal pens, scrubbed the troughs, and raked away years of dirt and straw. The work was exhausting, but it filled Emily with a purpose she hadn't felt since before the accident. Lily seemed to thrive too, her face flushed with sun and effort. She laughed easily now, chasing the dogs through the grass, her hair flying behind her like a banner. Ryan, meanwhile, spent most of his time driving into town, claiming he needed to sort out paperwork. Emily didn't question him. She understood that he didn't belong here the way she and Lily did. He was a good man, steady and kind, but his world had always been one of order and certainty, not of cracked boards and haunted silences. At first, she thought the distance between them would close with time. Instead, it grew wider, stretched thin by the invisible pull of this place. At night, the air grew colder. They slept in the living room where the ceiling was strongest, their lantern casting a golden pool of light over the floor. The sound of wind pressed against the walls, but inside it felt strangely safe. The house creaked like an old body remembering movement after too long. Sometimes Emily thought she could hear footsteps in the hallway after the others had gone to sleep. Slow and deliberate, as if someone were walking the rooms to make sure everything was as it should be. Once, she woke in the middle of the night to the faint smell of tobacco. It was the same scent Tom used to carry on his clothes after long evenings by the porch. The smell lingered for only a moment before fading into the cool air, leaving her with her heart pounding and tears in her eyes. She didn't tell Ryan. She wasn't sure he would understand, or worse, he might think she was losing her grip. A week passed before she ventured into the attic. Dust hung in the air like smoke when she pulled the hatch open and climbed the narrow steps. The light from her lantern revealed boxes stacked neatly against the beams, their labels faded, but legible. Harvest 2009, tools, family photos. Her fingers trembled as she opened one. Inside were small, ordinary fragments of their old life. Tom's work gloves, a handful of receipts, a broken watch. Beneath them, wrapped in a piece of cloth, was a photograph of the three of them standing in front of the house. She was laughing, Lily on her hip, and Tom's arm was draped around her shoulders. They all looked sunburned and happy, unaware that time was already moving toward something final. When she came back down, her hands were shaking. She placed the photograph on the mantel, where it caught the light of the lantern. Ryan noticed it later that evening and stared at it for a long moment before turning away. He didn't say anything, but his silence was heavy. The following morning, a storm began to build on the horizon, dark clouds rolling in from the west. The wind picked up, rattling the barn doors and sending leaves skittering across the yard. Ryan wanted to leave for town before the rain started, but Emily refused to go. The animals were restless, and she couldn't bring herself to abandon them. She spent the afternoon nailing boards across the weakest parts of the barn, while Lily carried buckets of water inside. By dusk, the first drops began to fall, tapping gently against the tin roof. The storm was short, more bluster than fury, but it left the ground slick and the air heavy. That night, while checking the barn, Emily noticed something strange. One of the stalls she had locked earlier was open, the latch hanging loose. Inside, the straw was freshly turned, as though someone or something had been there. She searched the floor for tracks, but the dirt was too dry to hold any. The dogs barked once, and then fell silent. When she returned to the house, she found Ryan waiting on the porch, his expression unreadable. "You've been out there too long," he said. "You're wearing yourself thin over ghosts." "They're not ghosts," she answered. "They're alive." He didn't argue, but his eyes told her he didn't believe her. The next morning, Lily came running from the back of the house, her voice breathless with excitement. "Mom, come see! I found something!" Emily followed her to the old bedroom that had once been Tom's office. The floorboards there were uneven, warped by years of moisture. Lily was kneeling beside one of them, pointing to a small gap where the wood had splintered. Together, they pried it loose, and beneath it lay a small tin box covered in dust. Inside were a few folded papers and a photograph, aged but intact. On the front was their family again, standing near the barn, Tom's smile as wide as the sky behind him. On the back, written in his careful hand, were the words, "If you ever return, don't be afraid. This land isn't about death. It's about what keeps growing after." Emily felt the words settle inside her like a heartbeat. She sat there for a long time, the box in her lap, the room filled with the sound of rain sliding from the roof. It was as though Tom had been speaking across years just to reach her now, not to haunt her, but to remind her of what they had built together. She realized then that his letter about selling the ranch hadn't been about escape at all. It had been about freedom, the freedom to choose what to carry forward and what to let go. That night, when Ryan came home from town, she showed him the box. He listened in silence as she read the words aloud. When she finished, he rubbed the back of his neck, avoiding her eyes. "So, what does that mean?" he asked finally. "You think we're supposed to stay here now? Start over on a pile of old memories?" Emily looked around the room, the cracked walls, the dust, the smell of hay drifting in from the barn. "I don't know," she said. "But maybe this place isn't finished with us. Maybe it's not about what it used to be. Maybe it's about what it still could be." He didn't answer. That silence stretched between them like a shadow neither could step out of. In the days that followed, Ryan grew more distant. He spent longer in town, and when he was home, he moved through the house like a visitor. Emily tried to bridge the gap, but the land had a hold on her now, a quiet gravity that drew her back again and again to the fields, the barn, the animals. She felt it every time she touched the soil, every time the wind brushed against her face. There was something alive here, something that didn't want to be forgotten. One evening, after Ryan had gone to bed, she stood alone on the porch. The moon hung low, silver light spilling across the fields. The air was still, except for the soft rustle of the grass. From somewhere near the barn came the faint sound of a creaking hinge, then a low whinny. She listened, her heart steady. There was no fear, only recognition. She knew she should feel trapped here, caught between what was and what should have been. Instead, she felt anchored. The ranch was no longer a monument to loss. It was becoming a place of continuance, of stubborn, breathless life. Inside, Lily murmured in her sleep. Ryan turned restlessly on his side, his face hidden in the shadows. Emily looked once more toward the barn before closing the door behind her. The house settled around her with a slow, familiar sigh, as if it too had made a decision. Whatever happened next, she understood one thing with absolute clarity. This place would not be sold. Not yet. Not while there was still life breathing within its walls. The house had refused to let go, and somewhere deep inside her, she realized, neither had she. Spring came slowly, as if the land itself were waking from a long, reluctant sleep. For weeks the ground remained pale and stubborn, the grass brittle and lifeless underfoot. But then one morning the light shifted, and everything seemed to breathe again. Moisture clung to the air, soft and clean, and the faint green of new shoots appeared along the fence line. Emily noticed them first. She stood on the porch in her boots, arms crossed against the chill, and watched as the earth began to change color. It wasn't much, just a whisper of renewal, but it filled her with a quiet hope that felt like forgiveness. The ranch had taken on its own rhythm now, one that guided their days without words. Every morning she and Lily tended to the animals. The old horse Grace, as they had come to call her, had grown stronger, her coat thick with health, and her gait steady once again. The dogs followed them everywhere, a loyal procession that never strayed far. Even the hens, once skittish and thin, had grown plump and loud, their clucking a steady chorus beneath the sun. Emily had begun to record small notes in a worn leather book she found on the shelf feed measurements, hatch counts, weather changes. She didn't know why she did it, only that it felt right. Tom used to keep a book like that, a quiet ledger of life. Ryan had softened somewhat. He still went into town several days a week, but when he was home, he worked beside her in the fields, mending fences or patching the roof. There was still a distance in him, but it was less sharp now, less born of jealousy and more of unfamiliarity. He wasn't a man of land and soil, yet he had begun to understand the language of this place, the way silence spoke louder than argument, the way the wind seemed to carry history in its sighs. Sometimes at dusk, she would see him standing at the edge of the pasture, hands in his pockets, staring out over the field. He never said what he thought in those moments, and she never asked. Some understandings didn't need words. The house, too, was changing. The repairs were slow, done with care and patience rather than haste. Emily sanded the banister smooth, nailed new boards over the broken ones on the porch, and rehung the curtains she'd found, folded away in a chest. The smell of sawdust and soap replaced the heavy dust of neglect. On the mantel, the photograph of her, Tom, and Lily remained, no longer hidden, but proudly displayed. Ryan had not asked her to take it down, and she was grateful. The past was part of the walls now, woven through every beam, every nail, and denying it would have been like trying to cut out her own heartbeat. The nights were easier than before. The ghosts that had once walked the hall no longer frightened her. If anything, they seemed to bring comfort. Sometimes she still heard the faint creak of a door where none had moved, or caught a scent of tobacco when no one had smoked. But instead of sorrow, she felt companionship. The house was not haunted by loss anymore. It was inhabited by memory, and memory, she had learned, was simply love that refused to leave. Then, one afternoon, as the sky dimmed into a muted blue, the wind shifted. Emily smelled rain, At first, it was only a trace. A metallic scent mixed with the sweetness of the soil, but it deepened quickly, rolling across the land in a low hum. The horizon darkened, and the clouds swelled like bruises. She felt the old fear rise in her chest, sharp and electric, the same fear she'd felt on the night the storm had taken Tom. Her hands trembled as she gathered buckets and tools, her mind already calculating what needed to be secured. She could see the animals growing restless, pacing the fences and stamping the ground. The air felt heavy, thick with warning. Ryan came running from the barn, his shirt damp with sweat and dust. "It's coming fast," he said. "We need to get everything inside." Together they moved quickly. Emily led the horses into the stable, while Ryan reinforced the doors with planks. Lily gathered the hens into crates, her small hands shaking but determined. The first drops of rain began to fall, heavy and cold, each one leaving a dark mark on the wood. Within minutes, the sky opened fully, and the world became a blur of wind and water. The sound of it was deafening. The barn shuddered under the force. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the fields in brief, violent flashes. The dogs howled from their corner, and Grace whinnied in fear, stomping her hooves. Emily moved toward her, speaking softly, her voice nearly lost to the storm. The horse's eyes rolled white, but she pressed her head against its neck, feeling the frantic pulse beneath its skin. "Easy," she whispered. "You're safe. We're all safe." The words were as much for herself as for the animal. Ryan's voice cut through the roar. "The north wall's bowing." He was already there, bracing it with his shoulder, as if he could hold back the wind by will alone. Emily ran to him, grabbing a fallen beam and wedging it against the support. The rain poured through every gap in the roof, soaking them to the bone. For a moment, she was back in another storm, another lifetime. Tom's voice shouting her name, the crash of wood, the scream of the wind, and she thought she might break. But then she saw Lily standing in the doorway, clutching one of the dogs, her face pale but steady, and something inside Emily shifted. She wasn't the same woman she had been then. She wasn't the one who fled the land in grief, leaving everything behind. She was here now, fighting not against the storm, but alongside it. They worked through the night, hammering loose boards, tying ropes, covering feed with tarps. When the wind grew too strong, they huddled together inside the barn, bodies pressed close, listening to the fury outside. Hours passed, though it felt like days. Eventually, the thunder began to roll farther away, and the rain softened to a steady drizzle. Dawn crept in quietly, the sky bruised but brightening. When they finally stepped outside, the world looked new. The ground was soaked, the fields glistening like mirrors. The air smelled of wet earth and clean beginnings. The house had taken some damage, a few shingles lost, a gutter torn loose, but it still stood, solid and defiant. The barn had held as well. Emily turned to see Grace, lifting her head toward the sun, droplets shining on her mane. The hens clucked softly in their cages, and the dogs shook themselves free of mud. Everything was alive. Ryan leaned against the doorframe, exhausted. His clothes were torn, his hands blistered, but there was a faint smile on his face. "You did it," he said. "We did it," she corrected. Lily ran to her, throwing her arms around her waist. "The house didn't fall," she said proudly. Emily looked up at the roof, at the smoke curling from the chimney where she'd lit a fire. "No," she said, "it didn't." The days that followed were a blur of repair. Ryan cut new boards to patch the roof, while Emily cleared debris from the yard. The storm had stripped away much, but it had also revealed something unexpected. The land beneath, rich and ready. When she dug her hands into the soil, it felt soft and fertile, not barren as before. It was as if the storm had washed away the last remnants of decay, leaving behind the promise of renewal. In the evenings, they sat together on the porch. The light of sunset spread across the fields, golden and deep. Emily would rest her head on Ryan's shoulder, while Lily fed scraps to the dogs at their feet. The quiet between them no longer felt heavy. It was full, alive with understanding. Sometimes, when the wind blew from the west, Emily thought she heard the faint creak of the old windmill turning again, and she imagined Tom there, somewhere beyond sight, watching with a smile. As the weeks turned to months, word spread in town about what they'd done. Neighbors began to visit, curious to see the ranch that had come back from ruin. Some brought food or tools, others just came to talk. Children followed Lily through the yard, feeding the hens and petting Grace. Even those who had once scoffed at Emily's decision to stay came quietly, humbled by what they saw. The land had become something more than property. It was a story of survival, of second chances, and it seemed to draw people who needed a bit of that hope themselves. One evening, a man from the county office arrived with papers. He shook Ryan's hand and congratulated them on restoring the ranch's official registry. "Harlow Ranch is back on the map," he said. "It's yours again, Mrs. Harlow." The name startled her for a moment. Harlow, her first husband's name. Yet instead of sorrow, she felt gratitude. The ranch wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to all of them, to everyone who had fought to keep it alive. That night, after everyone had gone and the sun had dipped below the hills, Emily sat alone on the porch. The air was cool, carrying the scent of grass and wildflowers. She opened the small leather notebook she'd been keeping and wrote the date. Beneath it, she added a single line: "The land remembers those who return to it with love." Then she closed the book and leaned back, gazing at the stars. Ryan joined her a few minutes later, sitting quietly beside her. He looked out at the fields, now lush and green, and nodded toward the new sign he had placed at the gate earlier that day. In simple carved letters, it read, "Harlow Ranch, established twice." Emily smiled. "Twice," she repeated softly, tasting the word. "That sounds about right." Lily came out then, barefoot, her hair loose around her shoulders. She carried a small blanket and sat on the step below them, humming to herself. The dogs curled up at her feet, their eyes half closed. Grace grazed peacefully in the pasture, her silhouette framed by the pale glow of the moon. For a long time, none of them spoke. The night was too beautiful for words. The crickets sang, the wind whispered through the fields, and the old house behind them seemed to breathe in time with the earth. Emily thought about Tom, about the years they had spent building this place, and the years she had spent mourning its loss. She thought of the letter he had left her, the one that had once felt like a command, but now read like a blessing. He had wanted her to find life again, and she had. She reached for Ryan's hand, their fingers intertwining. "You know," she said quietly, "I think he'd be proud." Ryan looked at her, the lines of his face softened by the moonlight. "I think he already is," he said. The words lingered between them, not heavy with grief, but light with peace. Emily turned her eyes to the horizon, where the first hint of dawn began to blur the darkness. The land stretched out before them, endless and forgiving, humming with life. It wasn't the same ranch it had been years ago, and neither was she the same woman. The house no longer belonged to the past. It belonged to what came after, to the hands that mended it, the hearts that filled it, and the love that refused to fade. The ranch had endured storms, silence, and sorrow, yet here it stood, alive again, a living testament to what could grow from loss. Emily closed her eyes, letting the soft wind touch her face. The earth beneath her feet was warm. Somewhere behind her, the house creaked, as if sighing contentedly. The world felt still, complete. She smiled, knowing that everything, Tom, the land, the life she had rebuilt, had found its rightful place at last. And as the morning light spread across the fields, turning them gold once more, Emily Harlow finally understood what the ranch had been trying to tell her all along. That love, real love, never ends. It simply changes shape and keeps on growing. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe and stay with us for the next ones. Watch more stories on the channel and share this video so others can find it too.